Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you guys doing? And welcome to another podcast where I'm with a very esteemed and very accomplished guest who is Abdullah Al-Andalusi, an individual now as a researcher for the I3 Institute. And we're here in the I3 Hub in Canada, where we've had events where we've spoken about the Palestine issue. First of all, a quick one. What do you make of the whole issue you're looking at this and what's your assessment of it all?
Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So the current situation in Gaza is a continuation of a very consistent Israeli historical policy of aggression, expansion, and settlement. And so because Israel has always been consistently initiating wars, fighting, using pressure tactics by maintaining, even at times of peace, a low level amount of military operations and police and security operations, despite the fact they might agree to ceasefires. And this always inevitably antagonizes the Palestinians and others to retaliate or to protest in some way or form. And then Israel uses a pretext to advance its territorial and strategic goals further.
Okay, well, I do want to delve a little bit into the historical analysis with you, because I know that you've done a lot of research on that. And before I do so, I just want to make it clear that the importance of this is actually on the information war, that when, say, for example, pro-Palestinian activists, Muslims and others, are making the case that they should be making a case using solid and sound argumentation. And so what you're going to do hopefully today is you're not going to elaborative detail, but you're giving them a taster of some of the give them a skeleton of what's happened historically. If they're interested, obviously they can go and do their own research. So let's start with, when do you want to start? When do you think is a good time to start historically?
I think that first we need to make a very basic argument that I think Muslims need to know, and anyone who advocates for the Palestinians needs to know, which is this. The Zionist narrative is that they're responding to attacks against themselves. But they never explain, and never can it be explained, what is the motivation of the opponents they're claiming are attacking them. Because they will say, oh, they just hate us, or they want to wipe out Israel's political entity, or kill Jews.
Or Hamas, or they'll say, look, Hamas is a terrorist organization. They're trying to, it's all their fault.
But remember, they always kind of explain the motivation as just this inexplicable evil. Mm-hmm. But human beings don't work like that, right? Human beings have usually make rational choices depending on how to achieve their objectives.
Sure.
And their objectives, more or less, when it comes to collectives, are what they would deem to be reasonable or attainable. Mm-hmm. So if the Zionists are arguing that Hamas or others just want to wipe out all Jews from the face of the earth, or wipe out all Jews in Israel, which is their narrative, how would that make sense by just firing a few rockets or just doing a one-way suicidal raid into just neighboring settlements and military bases? That's not going to destroy Israel. That's not going to harm its strategic, or have no strategic effect actually on Israel. So if that doesn't make sense, which it doesn't, we have to ask further questions. What's going on? What's happening that is not so reported on the scene, that is making either the Fatah or the Palestinian Authority or Hamas or the average Palestinian respond with anger and being upset, or even responding with either protests or violence?
Because, of course, before 1987, there was no Hamas, and in the West Bank, there is no Hamas. So even now, until this time, so going into the historical analysis, removes Hamas essentially from the assessment, from the analysis.
Well, I mean, just this year, there was a major Israeli security operation that killed tens of Palestinians in the West Bank, and there was no Hamas there.
Exactly.
Right. So we have to ask this question as to what's actually going on. What is Israel actually doing to the Palestinians, which is not reported, and it's usually a day-to-day, just their normal experience of life for the Palestinians. What's happened to them to make them react with such outbursts?
Right. So tell us some quick facts in terms of historical facts of people might not even understand what is the beef going on here. I mean, who are the natives to the land of Israel? Is it the Palestinian Arabs? Are they the Jews? Is it a combination of both? What's the beef about? When did it start? I'm not going to go all the way back into ancient history here. Let's keep it contemporary. What would you say to this?
Well, the argument from the Zionist narrative is that the ethnic group which they represent, which they claim they represent, they don't represent it. Of course, many Jews condemn, significant majorities condemn Zionism, but their argument is that Jews are not invaders of Palestine, and Zionists not invaders of Palestine because Jews are natives of Palestine. They were there 2,000 years ago. They're just coming back home after 2,000 years.
Okay.
So this really is a side point, but they use it as a justifying narrative, so we have to discuss it.
Of course.
So if we're just going to discuss it from a purely just a historical analysis, the oldest historical record, which has some corroboration in some parts, not entirely, but has some corroboration, is the Torah, or the Tanakh, the Old Testament, as Christians call it. And if you look at that, and you also look at archaeological evidence, we see that the Israelites haven't always been there. The Israelites being the 12 tribes of Israel, Judah is one tribe of Israel, which then was used to call the Jews. They invaded the land. The people that lived there were called Canaanites, or the land was called Canaan, or Canaanites, with the inhabitants, and they were invaded, and there was a kind of genocide of them by the invading Israelite tribes, as reported in the Bible.
In the Old Testament, right?
Yeah. So if you're going to be historical, just purely historical, the Israelites were invaders of the land. Approximately, they say about roughly, historians think about 1200 BC. And they remained in the land. There was wars with rival empires and things, and they were moved around and things like this. But at some point after 70 AD or so, as they say, or the Common Era CE.
Yep.
Many Jews immigrated, although they immigrated actually before that. I mean, Rome is reported to have 50,000 Jews at least 100 years before, 50 to 100 years before the 70 CE. They're mostly economic migrants. They were going for better prospects in Rome and so on and so forth. So many Jews left for various reasons. People would leave for any reason. Better prospects, what have you. And of course, it was a land that was in the crossroads. So there was many wars and things. It was a very unstable place to be.
You made a really good point before when we did this this segment. I'm not sure if people remember, but I do. If you want more information, we've done a reaction before on the Jordan Peterson discussion with Netanyahu.
Yeah.
And you made a very, very good point, which I remember, which is that if you really count the years of, let's say, the Arab majority in that area versus the Jewish majority in that area, you were saying it's more with the Arab majority.
Okay, so basically, why I mentioned the habitation of Jews who would later be called Ashkenazi Jews. So let's just call it. Let's say European Jews for short. So Ashkenazi Jews left that region before there was an uprising by Jews against Roman occupation, and they were there for even hundreds of years, even after 70 CE. The Zionists always cite 70 CE as the time that Jews were kicked out without their will and consent. That's historically not true. There was no mass kicking out. There was further rebellions. You can't have further rebellions in a place where there's no people to actually rise up. So that's not true. And
there was an expulsion, though, of course, in 70 AD, right?
No, there was a capture of many Jews who were part of the uprising, and they were enslaved and sent to Rome. But there were already Jews in Rome, a significant proportion who were just economic migrants, not slaves.
Yeah,
that's the point. And there were Jews. There was still a significant majority of Jews residing in Palestine afterwards.
Yeah.
Now here's the thing, right? So Ashkenazi Jews, if you count the amount of, if you take 70 CE as a basis, what you'll find is that if you count the amount of time that Israelites have been in that land in total. So up to that point, so let's take 1300 years.
Yeah.
And the amount of time they've been outside the land since 70 CE. So let's say for Ashkenazi Jews, they started to come in greater numbers in 1800s. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So they've been outside the land for 1,800 years.
Yes.
And they've only ever been inside the land, ancestrally speaking, for 1,300 years.
Very interesting point.
So they were invaders they were invaders at the beginning.
Yes.
And let's say even if we concede they got kicked out, which they didn't.
Yes.
The majority of them weren't kicked out, but they've been living outside the land for longer than their ancestors ever lived inside the land.
Beautiful point.
So how are they natives then?
Yes, because now we have to go to what is native, what is being native or indigenous to a land. Yeah. Excellent. So that's a really good background. Let's get to the modern era now. Because,
okay. So like fast forward. So the land has had many people in it. Just want to make a point that DNA studies on both Palestinians and so on have showed that Palestinians have about 60 to 70% DNA traced to Canaanites, right?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and because many Canaanites might have converted to Judaism and then convert to Christianity and then convert to Islam, right? And
Interesting.
But they speak Arabic, so they're just called Arabs. Understand? Because as you know, an Arab is anyone who speaks Arabic. There's also analysis done on Lebanese people, and it showed that they were like about 90% Canaanites.
Really?
So the people that live in that region are more or less they've lived there for, and that's by Canaanite, up to 4,000 years ago. So it's pretty old. So now we've established that, because Palestinians are often said that they're just Arabs that invaded from Arabia in the 7th century. No, just because they're called Arabs doesn't mean they're Arabians.
Sure.
Yeah, they're just Arabic speakers. Okay. Now there were Palestinian Jews which resided for that time. I'm not gonna, they were called Palestinians along with everybody else by the British and others. Yeah. Okay, so now we get to kind of more the 18th century and so on. You have political Zionists rise up in Europe. They are complaining about how Jews are treated in Europe. In Russia there's pogroms. There's discrimination in Western Europe. There's no pogroms anymore around about that time. But
what
Jews,
year are we here?
So we're talking about the 19th century, so the 1800s up to the middle 1800s. So there was issues of Jews are discriminated.
Oh, the Jewish problem it was called, isn't it?
In various Western countries, they were, because they were viewed to have different customs, different beliefs, and so they were viewed to be this, a minority that couldn't really blend in very well by many races at the time. But there was no pogroms or massacres in France, England.
Not just yet.
Yeah, of course. United States of America, Canada, of course. There was, and in fact, Jews received quite a lot of rights in England and America and so on and so forth, which is these are America being a melting pot of different ethnicities or immigrants. Okay, so what happened was that there was an argument by political Zionists that the only way to solve the problem of discrimination and racism and so on and so forth is that Jews need to control their own land. Right, they have to have a land, and they have to be in control of it. The ones who control the power, their ethnicity, not other ethnicities. Or America, you have rights. There's no pogroms against Jews. There never was. Yeah. But that was not really discussed. Right. Yeah. But this was an age of nationalism.
So this is the time where people like, Theodore Herzl and Chaim Weizmann and others would send correspondences with the British Empire asking them for land. And then the British Empire would come back and say, for example, hey, you got Uganda as an example with Chaim Weizmann, or Argentina with Theodore Herzl. And they were like, no, it has to be. And these are primary sources which anyone can get very easily. And they were like, no, it has to be Palestine. It can't be Uganda and it can't be Argentina. And so these are kind of conversations that are happening. Obviously, this is right before the Balfour Declaration in 1917. So to fast forward to that now, we've got all this Zionist, jargon, or let's say narrative.
So to raise the point, so basically, at first there were different types of Zionists. Some were cultural Zionists. They just wanted a central hub in the world where you can have a cultural hub for Jews. They weren't talking about politics. They didn't really care about politics so much. So they began immigrating to Palestine and under Ottoman rule. So Ottomans allowed Jews to come in to immigrate into Palestine. But when there was caught wind of political Zionism as an ultimate goal, there was some issues like, well, are you coming here just to be part of the people? No problem. But are you coming here to take over the place and become and make an ethno-nationalist state? That's something else. That's a different discussion. So Jews began immigrating into Palestine under the Islamic Ottoman Caliphate. Yes. But it was only when the British invaded, and of course just prior to that invasion, where there was an agreement between some rich, influential Jewish bankers and others in England, with, of course, the British establishment to say, look, we can basically we would like to reside in that land as a homeland for ourselves, as an ethno-nationalist state for Jews, and the British made that deal. Right. So when we take it over, we will be committed to, as the Balfour Declaration, will be committed to establishing a Jewish homeland for you. The benefits for Britain was it's a bit long-winded, but in essence, it was useful for them to have those that would be willing to cooperate with them having a strategic outpost to control a strategic region. So Britain wanted to use the Zionists to be an outpost for British strategic interests.
So we've covered the kind of the genetic history, if you like. And then we moved into, like, say, in the 19th century. We talked about kind of very briefly, and of course, this is just superficial, but trying to get the main points here for people to have a clear timeline in their minds. And then we're here at the Balfour Declaration of 1917 and the British mandate for Palestine, which is effectively Britain's control of Palestine. It was called the British Mandate at that time. So let's move a little bit forward now, maybe through to the 30s and 40s, right? Of course, before World War II. Where there was mass immigration of Jewish people into the land of Palestine. Of course, there was lots of things that happened there.
So I mean, the Balfour Declaration is basically an agreement between Walter Rothschild, who was a Jewish backer to the political Zionism, and of course Arthur Balfour. So once then the British kind of finally conquer Palestine, and with the help of kind of Arabs from Arabia under Sharif Hussein and others, they had initially promised to give the land to Sharif Hussein. There was an agreement, you could say, with Sharif Hussein that actually was 2 years before the Balfour Declaration. This is important because people claim that then legally speaking, the Balfour Declaration is a legal document that gives ownership to Zionists, but technically because it was an agreement with the occupying power. But the British actually made a prior agreement to actually give Sharif Hussein almost all of Al-Sham.
That was about 1915, right?
Yeah, 1915, so on and so forth. That's just a slight
interesting point. Yeah.
But so they once the British control Palestine, they create a mandate, so the mandate of Palestine, where they're meant to be supervisors over it until it can become an independent state, much like they did in different parts of the Muslim world, cutting into pieces, making nation states. But they then start increasing migration, allowing mass migration of Jews from Russia who are escaping persecution, so on and so forth.
Yes.
Political Zionists from countries that are not where there wasn't persecution, like Britain and so on and so forth. Interesting enough, many Jews came to Palestine and then used it as a jumping off point to actually go to America, because America was better prospects and it was, promised freedom and rights. So they said, well, why are we going to go to this more desolate area? Yeah, and that has an already indigenous population who are not too happy about British occupation. Why am I going to go here? Why not America? And that's why the second most populous place in the world where Jews reside is United States of America. Only a few million difference between the amount of Jews that live in America and the amount of Jews that live in the land of Palestine.
So as these people are coming in now, or the Jewish people are coming into Palestine, now we're seeing a population or demographic change, and this, if you like, it really does go up exponentially in the 1930s, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And then you've got things like the Arab Revolt, which take place, which is a very key time and place which forced the British people to take note. Chamberlain, for example, who was the then Prime Minister at the time, then moved on to, like, the white paper and stuff. Maybe I think that was 1938 or something.
Sure.
Like that. So give us a little bit of it going. What's happening here? So
basically, the political Zionists were initially naive, i.e., they didn't care about the population, the native population, what they would say or do, thinking that they would just accede to whatever the British give to the Zionists.
Yeah.
So they didn't think there's going to be any resistance initially, right? Or they think that it could be easily just dealt with.
So this is sorry, Kyle.
Yeah.
But this is very important. So Palestinian resistance effectively starts in the 1930s. I mean, we're talking about new age Palestinian resistance, where there's violence or, if you like, protest action, and there's an action against both the Zionist groups and the British Mandate.
Well, yeah, from 1936 to 1939, there's basically called the Arab Revolt, where they revolt against the British occupation and the British a kind of attempt to create an ethno-nationalist state for Jews.
And there was no Hamas at this time, was there?
There's no Hamas or
just in case anyone thinks. That's right. Yeah.
So this is the people that are there, and they're not happy. Now, the argument initially is that Zionists were coming and just buying land, and they weren't forcing people off. But this is not exactly entirely the full story. The full story is that there would be a kind of a one-sided market where they would come. Arabs who were selling their land, because everyone's buying and selling. You have an equilibrium, buying and buyers and sellers. So what they do is the Jewish National Fund would be set up, or certain types of Zionist funds would be set up. They would buy any land from any Arabs who were selling, and even if that through sometimes a proxy, they'd get an Arab intermediary to buy it, because many people didn't want to sell to Zionists, so they got an Arab intermediary to buy it. Then they would buy the land. Now, the land has people working on it, right? You might have people who are tenant farmers who are renting and so on. If they're all Arab, they'd all be kicked out, right? Because I'm the new landlord now. It's actually the Jewish National Fund. You're going to be kicked out and replaced with Jewish tenant farmers. Yeah. Now, imagine someone buys a house of flats, okay? And let's say the House of Flats is in a part of London or what have you, where it's like 60% Afro-Caribbean, let's just say, right? So they get a new landlord and they say, right then, everyone who's Afro-Caribbean, I'm going to kick you out and I'm going to replace you with white people, right? And only white people. What would you say? So that's pretty racist.
Of course.
Yeah, and you're ethnically, you're not like killing or people per se, but you are in a sense ethnically cleansing,
of course,
by other means. Yeah,
of course.
So that was happening.
Yeah,
and the cities in Palestine became filled up with Arabs who were landless because they had been kicked out of their land. They were tenant farmers, and they didn't have anywhere to go. And this became a problem such that the Peel Commission was commissioned by Britain to investigate what to do about all these Arab tenant farmers.
What year was this Peel Commission?
So the Peel Commission, I mean, kind of happens after the Arab Revolt, and the white paper is produced, which gives a solution to the problem.
And that's by Chamberlain, and that was at first very much taken badly by the Zionist groups, who, after that had been released, because it wasn't as favorable as they wanted it to be, then started to ramp up the terrorism, isn't it? And at this time you had the Irgun and the Levi and other groups which were effectively Jewish terrorist groups who started to act in a manner to kill non-combatants, didn't they?
Yeah. So 1937 Peel Commission uncovered these problems of and they recommended that the best solution would be maybe to partition land and kind of deal with maybe stymie mass migration, because one of the issues that the locals were having problem with was that all this mass migration was coming into their land to the point with the express intention of creating an ethno-nationalist state where they would then be a minority on their own land.
Of course.
Okay. So anyone who lives who's a native of their own land wouldn't like to know that basically they're being in essence rendered a deliberate minority, and they would never achieve kind of political sovereignty for themselves.
Of course.
Right. So then the British tried to then placate the Arabs to this extent. They have the white papers released and they implement a policy to reduce migration to more manageable levels. They don't stop it completely, but they reduce it. And how did the two kind of major groups, as you could say, military groups of the Zionists, because they actually had militant groups or militias. So that the Haganah and the Haganah. And which was the main one, which would later become the Israeli Defense Force, and of course you had the Irgun, and then you also had the Lehi and Stern gang. So these start kicking in terror operations against the British.
Of course, Haganah had much more of a considered tone in this whole thing. They weren't as brash and brazen as Irgun and Lehi. Would you agree with this?
Well, I mean, initially, they even worked with the British to suppress the Arab revolt. So they were trained, they had weapons and so on and so forth. But then they began doing deliberate terror attacks against Britain to force them to resume the Zionist plan, which is to increase mass migration with the hope that eventually the Zionists can get a Jewish majority in Palestine and then create a Jewish ethno-nationalist state where they are the majority.
And probably the most prominent example of that was 1946 King David Hotel bombing, wasn't it? With 91 people that were killed, civilians, including actually, they were British civilians for the most part. There's some Arabs that did die, but this was an attack on British people, wasn't it?
Oh, of course. I mean, but it's not just that. There were...
and by the way, sorry,
there were ships of...
Just to cut off, very interestingly, Just like we're seeing nowadays with the Israeli army saying that this hospital or this hotel or this thing is housing the terrorists, they made the same kind of argument. They said this is the headquarters for the British Empire or the headquarters for the British, and we have to bomb it because they're there. And in fact, they did the same tactics of warning the people in the hotel that there's going to be some kind of an attack on there, and they killed the people there, the non-combatants and others, in the same way. And these were white people. And I want to make it very clear that the same tactics that the Israeli Defense Force is employing now with Palestinian people, the Zionist Irgun, which was their, if you like, predecessor, employed with white English people.
Yeah, and also what people don't realize, because some people say, well, because the Irgun and Lehi and so on, they were pretty... They would be killing outright, and regardless of whether the media would ever at the time would cover it, they'd be outright just killing women and children.
Yes, they would. Yes,
Palestinian Arab women and children. The Haganah at least attempted to try to not appear to do so.
Yeah.
But when in reaction to the white paper, the British white paper in October 45, they actually all officially joined forces to call themselves the Jewish Resistance Movement.
Yeah.
Right, so the Haganah were totally happy to unite with these people.
Yes, they were. Yeah,
right, to fight the British, and there were even refugee ships or ships that had kind of Jewish refugees, where the British tried to kind of turn them around from Palestine to send them to elsewhere in following the white paper.
Yeah,
and the Haganah bombed these ships with Jewish people on these ships, sunk them and killed Jews to make a statement. The statement was that you must allow, these migrants to come to the state of Palestine. Don't send them elsewhere.
And what's really powerful and interesting about this is that some of the key figures of these Jewish terrorist groups ended up becoming prime ministers and presidents of the state of Israel thereafter, like Begin, for example, Mahayan Begin. And Ben Gurion, of course, was part of Haganah, and he was the prime minister of Israel and a leading figure in the wars that Israel done with the Arab states, which we're going to cover next.
Well, in the history of Israel, you never see any Zionist terrorist who was even declared to be terrorist by the British and so on and so forth, and who actually did commit war crimes, you could say, ever be prosecuted by Israeli courts. You get Nazi war criminals being prosecuted by Israeli courts, but you never get former members of Irgun or Lehi or someone ever being prosecuted.
But they did call them terrorists, and that's something we're seeing which is different. When they were killing the white man, they were happy calling Irgun and Lehi and Stern Gang terrorists, and this was very clear in the front page newspapers of almost all the British outlets at the time. But when the same kind of operation is done to people of a different ethnicity, they don't want to call them terrorists because now they're a state and they're not killing white people, they're killing Palestinians.
Do you know what's the irony is that these when the Haganah and Lehi and were basically Haganah mostly were getting weapons and ammunition, and the British were trying to stop this.
Yes.
So they would smuggle weapons in, and they would hide them in civilian buildings, in hospitals underneath, and so on and so forth.
So using civilians as human shields.
They accuse Hamas of.
Exactly.
They did exactly themselves.
Well, I mean, you just mentioned they didn't mind their own effectively Jewish people being killed in the ships. I mean, and we should also point out that these groups, Irgun and so on, they also they always mention this Mahdi of Palestine having discussion with Hitler, but they don't mention the fact that the Irgun had a pact with the Nazis, which is known in peer-reviewed journals, and they both had the same united objective, which was to get rid of Jewish people from Europe and bring them to Palestine. So they had a reason to unite. So in many ways, the Irgun and the Nazis, I mean, they did collaborate, didn't they?
Well, I mean, what most people don't realize. Firstly, so just to explain the context. So, especially Benjamin Netanyahu, he claims that the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem at the time of the 1947 spoke with prior to 1947, of course, had met with Hitler. That's true, and Hitler wasn't really intending to kill Jews in a Holocaust, but this Mufti gave him the idea to do so, which there's no evidence for. It's completely ridiculous, and there's evidence there's well-known evidence to show that this was the plan that Hitler had well before.
Of course,
before that. So
he's trying to create a narrative, isn't he?
He's trying to create a narrative to blame the Holocaust on Palestinians, basically. And the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem is not the ruler of the Palestinians. The Palestinians didn't have a central government,
yes, of course,
to represent them, right? The Haganah and well, they were called the Yishuv, those who were these Zionists who were basically settling in Palestine. They had a kind of centralized kind of semi-government system alongside the British government that was occupying the land. The Palestinians were never united under any kind of one government or one rule or any of this kind of stuff. That's what led them to being so vulnerable to both the British and the Haganah prior to establishing the state of Israel.
So we spoke about, just to repeat the timelines, maybe people taking notes in this, and I do recommend that people take notes of this, that we spoke about kind of like the 1800s, the late 1800s or 19th century. Then we spoke about, the Balfour Declaration 1917. We spoke about then the British mandate to govern all over the 1920s. And then in the 30s, we mentioned 1936 in particular, which is the Arab Revolt. And then we mentioned the White Paper, which I think is the Peel Report is 1937.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned, of course, the White Paper, which I think is 1939.
Yeah.
Which Neville Chamberlain, the PM at the time in England. And then we went into the 1940s.
Yeah.
And we discussed some of the things, the terrorist action, that because of the anger of some of these Zionist groups, including, but not limited to Irgun and Sterngan, Lehi, and so on, they decided to take action. And we went all the way up to 1946 with one of the most egregious actions that was taken against white people, which is the King David hotel bombing in 1946.
Yeah.
Now we're kind of at the precipice of the inception of what is referred to as the State of Israel, which was incepted in 1948 in May the 20th. So tell us what's going on around there.
So let's start now. Let's start from when the UN resolution in November 1947 is adopted to recommend partition.
Of course.
So partition now the Zionists would claim that the Arabs didn't accept it, and but we accepted it. So but because they didn't accept it, it's not binding on us. First and foremost, they had no intention of honoring any partition. So Ben Gurion himself mentions, that if they would initially.
Ben Gurion, who is he?
Oh, sorry. So Ben Gurion would later on become the leader. He at this point he's the leader of the kind of the Jewish government prior to the establishment of the State of Israel, and then he becomes the leader of
the Haganah, right?
He's the commander of it, obviously.
And then he became the PM of.
He became the prime minister of.
And just for the people to know, it's a semi-presidential system in Israel, so you have a president and a prime minister at the same time.
Yes, yeah.
And the prime minister has more power than the president.
Yeah, because the president is just basically like a figurehead for ceremonies and symbolic. So Ben Gurion then kind of relates we see these discussions of meetings he had with his cabinet and other people. So we see him discussing that basically the partition was just a stepping stone.
Yes.
So they initially. The partition will happen. That means that allows them to create a state in the Jewish partition areas.
What is a partition? Just for people that don't know what this word means.
So the partition was the initial UN plan was to partition Palestine into two areas, which roughly approximates to allowing the West Bank to the Palestinians and Gaza to the Palestinians, and Jews to kind of be partitioned to have the majority settlements and cities through most parts prior to the 1967 borders. But not exactly like that, because the north was still for Arabs, like Jaffa and so on and so forth. Okay, so then what happens?
I mean, the proposal was more land than is currently given, of course, to Palestinians now in terms of territories. I mean, the initial partition had more land that was proposed to the Palestinians than is, for example, now under Hamas or the Palestinian Authority.
It was much more land. But then Ben Gurion kind of admitted in communiques his plan and for what they would do after the partition has been accepted.
Yes,
is that they would then demand from the Arab Palestinians that Jews should be allowed to settle in significant majorities, to make a majority in like the Negev and Transjordan. You mentioned this, Negev and Transjordan, and that if the Arab Palestinians say, we don't want to be a minority in our own land. And so we don't accept that. We don't want to accept any deals, any financial inducements or anything like this. Then they said they're prepared to use force, until they can settle on the entire land of Palestine.
Are we now before or after the establishment of the State of Israel? Have we established the State of Israel?
This is just prior to, So this is showing.
So you're talking about communications
This is
that
where
Ben Gurion had.
Ben Gurion was like, we're only going to accept the partition.
Yes.
Just so that people give us the space to create a formal state military apparatus, a state. Once we have that, we're not going to stop at the partition.
So someone will say, okay, that's a pretty tall claim. What's the source for this? Have you got any information, any source, academic citations?
Yes. I have the evidence right here. So Ben Gurion kind of clearly admits that in a meeting with the Jewish Agency executive, the Jewish Agency was the government, you could say, of the Zionists in Palestine. So it's in June 1938, in a meeting minutes, he argued that he talks about where someone says to him, shall we expand our population and transfer the Arabs out of Palestine by force? So he says that initially he wants to do he says mutual agreement with them when they'll see that they can't stand up to us, when they see that we give them financial incentives. But here's the thing he says. So let us assume that the Negev, for example, which is currently under occupation by Israel, of course, in the internationally recognized borders, quote unquote. So he says, let us assume that the Negev will not be included in the Jewish state. It will then remain barren. The Arabs are not capable or nor need to develop and build it. They have their fair share of deserts, and they lack the human resources, the money, and the initiative. This was typical colonialist mentality looking at these natives. They won't develop it like we would. And it's very likely that in exchange for our financial, military, and organizational scientific assistance, the Arabs will agree that we develop and build the Negev. It is also possible they will not agree. People does not always behave according to logic, common sense, and best interest. So they think, well, if these natives don't see that kind of giving it to us or allowing us to develop it is in their best interest, and here's now comes what the alternative is. So he's talking to this guy called Amos. Just like you, I feel a contradiction between your mind and your heart. So it's possible that Arabs will act according to sterile nationalist emotion and will tell us, we want neither your honey nor your sting. It is better for the Negev to remain barren than to be populated by you. And then he says, and then we will have to talk to them in a different language. And we will have a different language, which we will not have unless we have a state. Because we cannot stand to see such large areas of unsettled land capable of absorbing dozens of thousands of Jews remain empty. So this is what he says. And then he says, and then we will have to use force, and we will use it without hesitation, though only if we have no other choice. We do not wish and do not need to expel Arabs and take their place. Our aspiration is built on the assumption, proven throughout our activity, there's enough room in the country for both ourselves and the Arabs. But if we have to use force, to guarantee our own right to settle in those places, then we have force at our disposal. So here was his point, was that they first going to accept the partition to establish their state. When they have the state, they have an army. Now they have an army, they can now give the Arabs a choice. They say, now you let us settle, build settlements on the Arab partition areas, and take those lands, and you can be with us, and you can benefit from the finances and so on and so forth. We don't want to kick you out initially, as long as you allow mass migration. But if you don't, then we're going to take those lands by force, but not primarily to expel. They said initially, not primarily to expel the Arabs, but so that they can settle everywhere throughout the lands of Palestine.
Well, I mean, there are more explicit, of course, statements. Like, for example, Begin Mehekem. I can't pronounce his first name, but Begin, who became a president of the state of Israel, he had a book called The Revolt, and in it he's very, very clear about expelling with force, killing the people in the villages, the hate he has for the Palestinians. This is something you can get online. You can get a PDF copy of this particular book. Of course, when the state of Israel was established, you had formal, legal things which you can find, like, for example, Plan Dalet. And of course, Plan Dalet was, let me ask you, what is Plan Dalet for those who don't know? And tell us now on the inception of the State of Israel and then the subsequent Nakba that happened. Okay. What's going on with that, and what is Plan Dalet?
Okay, so Ben Gurion first thought that once you have a partition, and then and Zionists can then have a state, and the state can have an army, and then they can, in essence, diplomatically first try to make an agreement to take over the remaining part of Palestine. But if the Palestinian Arabs don't agree to that, then by force. So they're always going to take it over. Yeah. However, because in 1947, because then the Palestinians basically, they were not going to accept this. What happened was they used a pretext. So they said, okay, since the partition has been declared, and since then there is, we need to have the Arabic, states are not accepting this, the Palestinians are not accepting this. We need to kind of reinforce our state as much as possible, make it stronger as quickly as possible. We need to take strategic land, quote unquote. And so they accelerated their plans to take over the Arab partitions. So in essence, they launched a war in 1947, beginning in December 1947, ending in March 1948, to do clearing operations. And there was a plan called Plan Dalit, which was a plan that was given to all military commanders of the Haganah, that they would go to Arab villages and towns which are in strategic areas, quote unquote, which is basically most of Palestine, and they would assess the town. If the town is in a strategic area, they would basically clear out the population, yes. Right, through any means, right, generally. But there was unofficial communiques, things that are not recorded in such official plans, where in essence the Haganah leaders understood that if the state of Palestine was to be made a state, one whole state, like not separated, but everyone being equal citizens, the Arabs already had a majority still. There was still a majority of that land, and even in the Jewish partition areas that was given to Zionists, there was still a significant proportion. There was 40% Arabs. So the first thing they were going to do is they're going to clear out. They're going to change that demographic. Ben Gurion even cited that how can we have a Jewish state even with only 60% Jews? Even though they're still the majority, but it's the Arab minority is still too big, yeah. Right? So this led to basically they called clearing operations. They would go, either they'd give an ultimatum, or they would, if there was any resistance encountered from any Arab village encountered or town encountered, they were given full reign to just go in guns blazing, literally, and wipe them out if possible.
And obviously a good book for this is Ilan Pappé's Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. It's one of the staple books that someone wants more information on that. Yeah. Let's go forward, because I think a lot of the Israeli Zionist historians make it out as if, okay, now you've got the established, what it is you've got the UN who have put this partition plan, and it's been accepted. You got the establishment of the State of Israel, and then you had all this antagonism, you had all this provocation, you had all these attacks starting with 1948, with all these Arab states attacking Israel. Israel have always been defending themselves. Of course, what we've already shown right here is that everything's been aggressive. So how would you defend yourself against something like that? 1948, the Arab states came and attacked Israel.
So as I said, the UN partition plan was never respected by the Zionists. Like before they even established a state, right? So this is again in 47. They launched attacks to do land grabs in areas that was meant to be apportioned to the Palestinians. Now this is without the involvement of the Arab armies around, without the involvement of the Arab states. The Palestinians didn't have a formal army of any kind. They didn't have a centralized command, right? In many cases, each village had its own separate militia, right? There was no initiation of an invasion or even a land grab by Palestinians into the Jewish apportioned area or the Zionist apportioned areas. That didn't exist, okay? It was the only people that had an army and a centralized command was the Zionist kind of the settlers there under the Haganah.
Yes.
The Jewish Agency, as it was called. They're the ones that had a centralized government.
I see.
So they could launch offensive operations, and they did, into the areas that were meant to be Arab partition land. And they made the excuse, well, the Arabs aren't accepting the partition. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But they're not invading the Jewish partitioned areas, so to speak, that was given to Zionists. So but they just said, well, they're not accepting it, and so they started to invade. So that was, you could say, the initiation of an aggression, other than from the British invasion, you could say. This was where the Jewish Agency, which would then become the Israeli state, or the government, was the initiator of invasions, of actually itself invading and taking land.
Right, so we've got 1948, and then you've got...
So this is 47 till March 48. This already kicks out 100,000 Palestinians out of their lands, right?
So tell us about the Nakba. What is the Nakba now?
Okay, well, technically speaking, this is the beginning of the Nakba, right?
Yeah.
So, which is the great catastrophe disaster where Palestinians are ethnically cleansed from towns and cities and so on and so forth. And then we have the kind of the declaration of the State of Israel on the 15th of May, 1948. Now, this is where like Plan Dalet was already formulated by this time to clear out. It wasn't in a response to the Arab armies coming in. The Arab armies, it wasn't response to Palestinians weren't streaming out of.
That's a good point, because they could say, well, that was Plan Dalet was a response to the Arab invasions, which would be historically incorrect.
Plan Dalet was even before the declaration of the State of Israel as an independent state, and the Arab army's response, and so on and so forth.
Brilliant.
So. So they declare, the day before the end of the British mandate, sorry, on the 15th of May, on the 14th of May, day before, Ben Gurion and the Jewish Agency declare the establishment of a Jewish state. Now, the Arab states protest against the separation of Palestine into partition to the UN. They submit a formal letter, and what their letter offers is that they say, look, don't cut it into pieces, make it all one state. Okay, they didn't talk about saying we must kick out Jews. No. They said one state, everyone becomes a citizen, and minority rights are protected under a democratic state. That's what they offered, right? Which means that, well, there were Jews living there, of course, after the migration, but they were still a minority, right? But the Arab states said, look, let's not create ethno-nationalist states. It's the British mandate is about to end. It's going to end. So let's just make a one-state solution. Everyone equal citizens. How about that? Yeah. Of course, the UN didn't accept that, of course. And of course, the Zionists would never accept that, because their whole point of their existence is to create an ethno-nationalist state whereby Jews are a majority in a democratic state, and therefore, by de facto, their ethno-cultural group determines the laws, the nature of the state, and so on and so forth, right? And I say ethno-cultural group because they've always had this very specific vision. Even when they established this law called the Law of Return, where they would allow anyone who claims Jewish ancestry to come and to return back to the land of their ancestors, right? In that law, and I ask everybody to read it, because people don't read that law, okay? If you can claim Jewish ancestry, significant Jewish ancestry, so your mother is Jewish, for example, you can then claim the right of return. You can be Jewish, you can be atheist, because Ben Gurion was atheist. They were socialists as well. The political Zionists weren't religious. Yeah, they didn't believe in God. Didn't care about that stuff. But if you are a Jew with ethnically Jewish, with a mother who's Jewish, but you become a Muslim or you become a Christian, you're not given the right of return to. So this shows you that the Zionist goal wasn't just to return people who had an ancestry back to the land. Yes. Yeah, and they certainly don't care about Palestinians. They're not included in that. It's an ethno-cultural group must predominate.
So racist apartheid regime, isn't
it? Racist and even religious discriminatory, because you could be ethnically Jewish but be Christian and Muslim, and you don't get to the right of return to go back there. Anyway, so that's a point.
So what's happening now with the Nakba? Tell us about that, because
so then you have all these Palestinians streaming out of Palestine. You have massacres occurring against villages that get widely publicized. You have massacres like Deir Yassin and others, which where women, children were blatantly killed. This is no one denies that, and just shot, or grenades were chucked into people's houses. So the Arab regimes around, and certainly their populations are very angry about what's happening, right? So the Arab regimes are pressured by their people, and they make a complaint. The Arab League makes a complaint to the UN saying that you have to stop this. This is you're seeing a massacre of Palestinians happening right now. We're not, they haven't even gone in yet. They haven't even, no entry, nothing like this, right? So then in response to that, they say, right, well, they gave that official letter to the UN saying that you establish a unitary state where everyone has equal citizenship, and if you're not going to do that, then we're going to do that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they didn't want to kick out all the Jews. They didn't say that. They said no ethno-nationalist state, one unitary state, everyone's equal citizen, and we have to rescue those who are being ethnically cleansed in that land. So that was the pretext by which they said that we need to go and intervene. Yes. And that was after all these refugees are banging on their door. trying to come into their land, like, please help and save us, and what have you. It wasn't, they were saying, no, don't worry, leave first, and then we will come in, whatever. Didn't exist. Or these claims that there was radio broadcasts that people that was telling the Palestinians to leave their lands, and so on, was false.
Yeah. So now, after this, you've got a series of wars that take place.
Yes.
We can't go into each of them in great detail.
Yeah.
We've got the Suez 1956 Suez Canal crisis.
Yes.
Not really a war, more maybe I don't know how, maybe it is a war.
Well, I mean, look, like this is quite. We can go this very quickly, which is basically that the Arab states sent only a token amount of army. They actually were outnumbered by the Zionists.
Are you talking about 1956 here?
No, I'm talking about the 1948 war when they come in.
Okay.
A further 600,000 Palestinians are made refugees.
Yes.
After they're kicked out. There are cities which even Ben Gurion ordered themselves to be depopulated. Like, you must leave.
Yeah.
I'll give you an interesting story in Bethlehem, as they say. When the Zionist forces were reaching there, and they were going to do the same thing they were going to do everywhere else to clear it out. Ben Gurion personally intervened to say, "Oh, wait, guys." We have the records of this, so that no one denies this. He says, no, not that. It's a majority Christian town, and the eyes of the world, the superpowers are mostly Christian. They're going to react very negatively if we kick out people out of Bethlehem, right? So in that, they personally intervened, which shows that Ben Gurion knew what a lot of his Haganah commanders were doing anyway, because he'd intervened specifically to tell them not to do it. You know, to make it the exception. So this shows you that they had an ethnic cleansing policy back then.
Yes.
All right. So now, 1948, the Arab armies failed to create a unitary state in Palestine, and that the state of Israel is created. They were outnumbered throughout the whole war. The Arab armies, they were ill-equipped to take on that. They were outnumbered by their enemy, which is ridiculous. Why would you send all these armies or regimes would only send a minority amount of soldiers who were outnumbered by the enemy? It shows that they weren't really interested.
Yeah.
They were just making a token gesture to placate their population, but it's a different discussion. Okay, so then fast forward then. So the Israeli state is established, but it doesn't control the West Bank. It doesn't control Gaza. Gaza is under control of Egypt. The West Bank is under control of Jordan. Yeah. Right. So then, in 1956, as you know, the Egyptian regime wants to nationalize the Suez Canal. Suez Canal was kind of co-owned by British and French interests. Egypt said, look, this is on our territory. We want to nationalize it for the interest of the Egyptian people and the state.
Yes.
Well, it should be owned by foreign powers. Yes. Okay. So then Britain, in cahoots with France, in cahoots with Israel, coordinate a invasion of the Sinai and the takeover of the Suez. Okay. There was no provocation against Israel. What's Israel got to do with this? Yeah. But this shows that Israel's main function has always been to further the strategic interests of the West. Its relationship with the West is that it fulfills its strategic interest in the Middle East. It's a launch pad.
Well, I mean, this is the time where a lot of historians say that there was a shift in terms of superpower status. Of course, it's after World War II.
Yes. Yeah.
And when America intervened, it's effectively telling the other guys that, look, why didn't you get me involved in this, and kind of put them aside, and that's how the situation was maybe resolved. Many historians would say this is when really the United States of America solidified its status as the world superpower.
Yeah. I mean, this is when now America starts to take over from Britain, right? So Britain uses its little pet project, and it becomes now under, it makes a deal with America. It found a better sugar daddy, you could say, for it. Yeah. And so this is the relationship between Israel and America.
But this shows you, this is the thesis that you're putting forward, that there was, effectively, you can't make the argument that Israel's defending itself here, because they're in cahoots with two other major powers of the world, ex-empires and the biggest empires in the world,
to interfere in the internal affairs
of another country,
of a neighboring country,
exactly,
which was nothing to do with anything that threatened Israel.
Absolutely. So then you've got something which is very well known, which is the 6-Day War, otherwise known as the 1967 War.
Yeah. So then now, like, fast forward,
and of course, people can research these things in their own time. We're giving them a bit of a, we went from the 1800s, now in 1967. So we're giving them a superficial, a skeletal, if you like, timeline, so they can do their own reading. But it's very important for people to know at least the timeline, right?
So yeah, like almost a decade later. So basically, Israel is obviously not just doing nothing, right? It's having clashes with its neighboring countries,
Of course.
but not just clashes in the sense of like they just fight army to army, because Jordan's not fighting Israel, Syria's not fighting Israel, Egypt's not fighting Israel, Lebanon army is not fighting Israel. Israel is launching raids into Jordan, into Egypt, but Jordan quite a lot, destroying Jordanian villages like the village of Samu, for example, and actually destroying the village, not just going in to fight, but they're actually destroying the whole village. They're claiming that this is a retaliation against Palestinian militants. Now, the issue is this, that what most people don't realize is that there was UN observers. Yeah. The UN observers at the time said that there was no known activity from the Jordanian-controlled West Bank by Palestinian militants. Secondly, Jordan itself was trying to maintain the peace by fighting the Palestinian militants itself, and they actually had killed more Palestinian militants than Israel had. Right? It was anyway. If it detected any, it would destroy them. Right? So clearly, Jordan was basically suppressing any potential or any militant, quote unquote, militant activity by Palestinians.
Could it not be argued? Of course, someone can say, well, on the flip side, you got Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, and he was very fiery and in his anti-Israel opposition. Yeah. And the 1967 war was nothing but a preemptive strike that attacked the artillery of a nation which was hostile towards Israel. Couldn't someone make this point?
Well, you see, here's the issue, right?
Yes.
Israel is attacking, the West Bank already, all right, under Jordanian control in 1966, 1 year before the 1967 war, and they're massacring a whole village and villages, attacking, bombing, constant raids. Yeah. So Jordan complains to the UN saying, like, do something about this, because this is like really horrific what they're doing, right? Jordan didn't even react militarily, all right? Because it doesn't want to provoke Israel, because it knows Israel's just waiting, right? Just waiting. It wants to provoke Jordan. Because the Zionists have a permanent interest. Well, the whole land of Palestine, as Ben Gurion kind of admitted many years ago, the whole land of Palestine is their target. They want to take all of it, right? They don't care about partitions are just a starting off point, yeah. But Jordan knows this, okay? Doesn't want to antagonize, yeah. But the Arabs in the Arab world are angry. Look, Israel's massacring whole Arab villages. What to do? So then Nasser's under pressure. Yeah, because he's viewed as the leader of the United Arab Republic, which is an alliance between Iraq and Syria and Egypt to become a kind of one state, kind of, but they're still separate in a way. So he's under this pressure. So he rattles sabers. He says, like, don't do this, and so he closes the Straits of Tiran. If you see that in the Sinai, it's on the east side of Sinai. There's the Straits of Tiran that leads to the south of Israel, the south tip of Israel, the Israeli state. And he closes it off as a gesture, and he moves some army forces next to the border of Israel to say, don't do this. And then, of course, America comes in, swoops in as always, say, okay, I'm going to de-escalate. We're going to negotiate with Nasser. There's a good possibility that he will open it up with negotiations. He's made his point, so on and so forth. And of course, there is communiques by Mossad, by the Israeli defense minister of the time, by American intelligence agencies, that Nasser doesn't actually want any war with Israel, because any fighting with Israel, because the 1956 war showed them that they would most likely lose such a war one-on-one. So, but they couldn't let the massacre of Arab villages go. So they were going to do a show of strength. Yeah. But it wasn't an invasion army coming. The army was too small to invade. You have to have mobilization of your population, mass mobilization. At this point,
quite frankly, one can say, even if they did want to invade, after all that's been done, it would have been totally justified. I mean,
yes, but the Zionist argument was that they were existentially threatened by Egypt.
Yes.
At this point, even though all their communiques, all the Mossad, all the intelligence agencies, and their own defense minister admitted afterwards in their memoirs, but we also have the classified cables, that they said that Nasser's not intending to fight. Nasser doesn't want to fight.
Well, can one argue that? Well, why did Nasser go to the Soviet Union and get armed by Czechoslovakia at the time? They were arming them. They had new military hardware and so on. If they didn't really want to fight, why are they doing all these things?
Well, I mean, Israel itself was getting weapons via Czechoslovakia too.
Right.
You know, they're buying weapons, they're buying arms to because 1956 war showed them that Israel took Sinai like that with
Yes.
the help of British. If you're Egypt and these people can just waltz into your country at will, you're going to want to defend yourself. You're going to want to arm up. But that was never argued. That was the existential threat, right? But then here's the thing, and this is what illustrated that what happened next was Israel's own initiation. Was Israel said, okay, they did a preemptive strike on Egypt,
Yeah.
but they took the Egyptian army completely by surprise.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if there was this is a great argument, because if they were under an existential threat and the Egyptians were trying to attack the Israelis, then how could it be a surprise that the Israelis hit them first? Isn't it?
It's like, look, imagine I'm angry at you. I say I'm angry at you. I'm going to beat you up, and I come at you, fists clenched,
Yes,
ready.
yes.
You've seen me limbering up. You've seen me get ready.
Yes.
I come right at you.
Yes.
I'm saying I'm going to beat you up, or I'm very angry at you, and then you punch me in the face. I go,
Yes.
why'd you punch me in the face?
Yeah. How could it be a surprise?
It wouldn't be. Why would it be a surprise? If I'm ready to face you, how are you punching me gonna surprise me?
Yeah, because the way in which all these airplanes and stuff like were destroyed in 6 days, you cannot argue that this was done.
And it wasn't even
It was
Egypt.
it was a surprise.
It was Syrian airfields. It was Jordanian airfields.
Yeah, of course.
There was an Iraqi airfield that was just next to the Jordan border.
Yeah.
That got obliterated too. Even
So
the Iraqis got obliterated.
I think it's consensus, even on those on the Zionist side. I mean, they'll gloat and boast the fact that it was a surprise. So sure. Now
So then what Israel did is, now because of that they've
taken the Sinai Peninsula.
They took the Sinai Peninsula a second time, and they wanted to hold on to it. They took Gaza, they took the Sinai Peninsula, but now they used that as a pretext.
And the Sinai Peninsula, for those who don't know, is a massive swathe of land.
Piece of land. Yeah. It's a few times bigger than Israel, the Israeli state's own controlled territory.
So you imagine now they've taken new land.
Yeah.
Which is illegal under international law.
Yeah. And because now Jordan was under a defense pact with Egypt,
Yeah.
and Egypt's being invaded, right? So Jordan basically just fires a few artillery shots into Israel to say, like to make at least a gesture that it's honoring its defense pact with coming to Egypt's help.
Yeah.
Because Egypt is actually being invaded at this point.
Yeah, of course.
And then Israel goes, now we got what we wanted. So then they invade the West Bank.
Yes.
Oh, now you're shooting us. Now we've got it. Now we got what we wanted, a pretext. And they had a pre-prepared plan to invade the West Bank.
So let's fast forward now. There's a lot of anti-Israel sentiment.
So this is how Israel justified its invasion. It also invaded the Golan, even though Syria had announced a ceasefire. It's stopping any military operations. It didn't want to fight. It declared it didn't want to fight, and they said, no, we're going to take the Golan as well, the Golan Heights.
Right. So now, at this point, when does the PLO come into play? The Palestinian Liberation Organization, otherwise known as Fatah. When does that initiate?
Okay, so this really, I mean, this kind of stuff really occurs really towards the end of the kind of Jordanian control of the West Bank now, because you have a whole bunch of Palestinians now under occupation by the Israelis.
So what year are we talking here?
So, I mean, this begins after the 1967 war. This is when a whole bunch of, these are people who had already left their homes. They still remember the Nakba.
So this is 20 years before the establishment of Hamas.
Oh,
Look, I'm only repeating this point because people are going to scapegoat Hamas, but Hamas didn't even exist at this time.
yes. So when Israeli attacks start attacking Palestinians and wiping out Palestinian villages, even before the 1967 war, the Palestinians are all trying to organize a resistance against this. So this happens in 1964.
Okay.
The PLO is established in 1964
Yep.
to be both a political organization for Palestinian rights.
Yep.
Yeah. And
they're nationalist and secular, just to be clear, right?
yes, yeah. They're not based on any motivated by any religious considerations. They have a mixture of Christian Arabs. As you know, 10% of Palestinians are Christian.
Yeah.
So in this, and actually, they even get recognized to some extent by the UN in 1974 as having observer status. So they get recognized as a national movement by the UN. Now, the issue is that they became a political party in 1965, and this is a political party, to get Palestinian nationhood. right, for themselves, a separate state. But once Israel occupies the West Bank and Gaza, and you have a whole bunch of Palestinian refugees, and did you know that more refugees were created now? They were kicked out and pushed more eastwards in the West Bank. So they were already people that were refugees 20 years ago, and they were pushed even further away, or kicked out to, or they left, or they were forced out and went to Jordan and other places like this. Jordan became so overcrowded with Palestinians, it was seemed like about 50% of the Jordanian population itself was Palestinian at one point, right? So they begin resistance and insurgent operations against Israel because they are now under direct occupation, right? Before they were under Jordanian control, where at least with the Jordanians they weren't getting racial discrimination, they weren't facing racial discrimination, racial harassment, or so on and so forth. But under Israeli control, that's when that begins, and that's when the insurgency occurs. So this is where then Palestinians are facing that. So the Zionists would say, what about the 1973 war?
Yep.
Wasn't that a war that was for our survival? We were existentially threatened. But again,
that was reclaiming Sinai, wasn't it?
That was yes, false. The Egyptian army wanted to reclaim Sinai. Afterwards, they argued that they had to regain the national honor because this was a big slap to their face that they lost the Sinai.
Absolutely, I think there was a lot of like anti-Israel sentiment at this time. The Egyptian population was absolutely outraged about what happened.
Yeah,
Gamal Abdel Nasser came out in 1967, and he basically apologized to the public.
Yes,
he was talking about reclaiming Sinai and stuff like that. It built up all the way up to 1970 when Gamal Abdel Nasser died. Obviously, Anwar Sadat at that time had taken power, and it was his start. And he started negotiating with the Americans, with Kissinger and so on. And what is narrated by primary sources is that he effectively said to him, we can't do anything to you or for you unless this becomes a crisis in the Middle East, which means that you effectively need to have something to negotiate with. With that, Anwar Sadat and others decided to go into Sinai and not take the whole thing over, just a portion of it, so that they can have something to go to the negotiation table with.
Syria invades, quote unquote, their own land, the Golan.
Yeah,
they want that back, and Egypt just invades Sinai, which was their land. They have very limited objectives. They only want to take those areas of land, right?
And even then, I mean, even in that war, the Israelis actually penetrated Egypt itself. I mean, Ariel Sharon, he went into Al-Ismailia, went all the way up. So it wasn't some passive war. Yes, I mean, most would say that, especially in the Egyptian context, that Egypt got what it wanted in terms of objectives of war and got the Sinai Peninsula back.
Yeah.
But now we're talking about Camp David, and so we move on in 1978.
Yeah.
So now there's this Camp David agreement.
Yeah. So all right. So Israel was never ever really existentially threatened since 1948 ever. And all the things that it does is never because it's existentially threatened. It's because either there's an opportunity to expand more land, or to suppress anyone that identifies as a resistance to it, even if they're not actively fighting with them at that point in time. Yeah. So, I mean, Israel regularly flies jets into Syria and bombs Hezbollah targets. No one ever talks about this, right?
Yeah.
Hezbollah is not currently fighting, the state of Israel, quote unquote, right? They're not in active war since the Lebanon war, the more recent one, but they bomb it regularly. They say this was a Hezbollah shipment of arms from the Iranian Revolutionary Guards in Syria. Okay, well, what Syria does in its own territory is none of your business, right? But they say, well, this is giving arms to a group that we don't like. Well, but the group you don't like, you're in a ceasefire with them. You're not actively fighting with them, but you're still bombing them, and that really shows Israel's policy. Is that say if we don't like you, they say we're just going to keep bombing you. Whether the difference between active war and peacetime is just the level of military operations that Israel does against you.
Sure.
That is the only difference.
Let's get to this point because we want to kind of maybe wrap up now. There's a lot we've spoken about in terms of the history, and there's a lot that people have that can take as, like I say, a skeletal historical timeline. Yeah. We've started from the 1800s and we're all the way here in 1980 now. I think Camp David was 1978, if I'm correct in that. The agreement between the Egyptians and the Israelis, and then you have Sinai given back in exchange for peace, everlasting peace with Egypt and Israel. So this takes place. Then you have from 1978 effectively, or let's just say you've got the peace that you wanted with the big countries around you, all the way up to, let's say, 2023, which is our year now. And of course, Fatah have, the Oslo Accords and these attempts to try and forge peace through negotiation and so on. All of that, as we've heard from Palestinian Liberation Organization representatives, has not been fruitful. And the Palestinians are becoming more and more angry about this. And then 1987, you have the establishment of Hamas. And so tell us now, from the establishment of Hamas until this time, what are the notable things that we should know? Maybe the intifadas, some of those things, right?
I mean, well, like, okay, so basically, Israel doesn't just do nothing, right? If you look at the history, it's invaded its neighbors multiple times since. Yeah, so it's invaded Lebanon 3 times.
Yeah,
everyone forgets that. Lebanon doesn't have an army to conquer anything, but because there's PLO organizations there, and then later on, the last one there was Hezbollah. They basically invaded, and they invaded again, usually as a response to a retaliation to their own low-level military operations. Because once they say they don't like you, they're going to they either do low-level attacks against you or high-level attacks against you. So in peacetime, quote unquote, they maintain this constant background hum of assassinations, bombing, targeted strikes, commando raids. This is what they call peace, or ceasefire. And so when people say, I'm sick, look, I don't like your ceasefire because your ceasefire is killing us. Yeah. Literally, we're going to protest by shooting a few rockets that are not going to really strategically do anything, per se. And then Israel goes, pretext, then raise it up to high-level military things too. They say, let's see if we can destroy this whole organization or change the strategic balance of Lebanon. So this is basically what they did. Like now, Hamas rises up in the midst in the issue of the Lebanon war, and is actually encouraged by Israel. So basically, the Lebanon war starts at 1982, and it was initially targeted at clearing out the PLO from Palestine, but they commit many outrages, the Israelis, and they use local nationalist Christian forces to fight. So the Hamas was founded in 1987. And it is, it as a response to the Israeli occupation of Lebanon, which was ongoing at this point in time,
and it was originally funded by the Israelis, I think, at one point, wasn't it?
Israel kind of secretly gave support to it as a rival to Fatah, because Fatah was secular.
Yeah, Fatah has PLO, by the way.
Yeah. And so Hamas is because it's more religious in orientation, quote unquote. It was deemed to be a rival to weaken the PLO.
Yes.
Yeah, by supporting a rival organization, which would then later on they'd lose control of course, because it would then get its own support. Now, Hamas is actually meant to be a political organization. Its military wing, the one that actually does the fighting, is called the Izz ad-Din al-Qassam Brigades. Yeah, and they were actually formed in 1993.
See.
Yeah, so that's already 5 years after Hamas was formed. So Hamas is a political party, and 5 years later it has a military wing that does the actual insurgency and fighting. So this is where this happens. Now, obviously,
then you have the intifadas and so on.
Yeah. So meanwhile, in Israel and in the West Bank occupied territories, Palestinians are under military rule. So they don't elect governments. They don't not represented by any governments. They don't have their own leaders that can approve building permits so they can house their own children in the next generation. So that stuff, they are stifled and restricted and face police harassment, brutality, killing on slightest pretexts, and so on and so forth. So in 1988 to 1993, they initiate the first intifada, from the Arabic word to kind of shake off. They wanted to shake off the occupation. It leads to 1,962 Palestinians dead, 270 Israelis dead. Due to the occupation of West Bank and Gaza, that's the key issue. Israel could have simply returned the 1967 kind of borders and not give it back to Egypt or to Jordan, but just give it to the Palestinians, who are too weak to make any army and will never threaten them ever. But they don't want to give it back. And the question is, why not? Jordan already relinquished the West Bank. It says, I don't want to have anything to do with it anymore. If anything that happens with the West Bank will be between you and the Palestinians. That was what it said to Israel, basically.
And there are 2 intifadas, right? So this is the first one that you mentioned.
Yes.
When was the second one?
Okay, so we have we have then the Oslo Accords that happens in 1993, which starts to talk about giving zones of control to the Palestinians. Then you have Oslo II, the Tabaa Agreement that happens in 1995, which talks about areas of disengagement. So they tried to so Israel makes this agreement with the Palestinians, and the Palestinians,
and this is the PLO,
especially PLO, the Yasser Arafat. They're very naive on this, but they're quite desperate. And this is like this, which is we're going to split the West Bank into 3 zones: Zone A, B, and C. Zone A, the Palestinians will control the security of it and the laws and the rules and regulations, administration. Zone B, the Palestinian Authority, which will be set up by basically the PLO becomes a Palestinian Authority, will control the administrative and laws, but they don't control the security of it. So basically, Palestinian government, but Israeli police, right? Basically, and Zone C, which is 60%, is controlled both by military rule,
yes,
and by the Israeli security forces. So the Palestinians are offered a few areas of the West Bank where they can actually control their own destiny. So they jump at it because they've never been offered that before. But it's a trap because it then justifies, it has a signature of a Palestinian Authority to the Israeli control of the vast majority of the West Bank, the Area C, which is 60%, and of course Area B, where they control the military and the security operations of that. So the Palestinians it was a kind of a trap because they've actually signed their own occupation. They've actually given consent, you could quote unquote, to their own occupation. A
simple point is that you don't have you're not allowed the military there, is it? The Palestinians are not allowed military.
But the Oslo Accords were not meant to be a permanent thing. It was meant to be phases of disengagement.
Yes.
So Israel would say, okay, Area A is yours, but eventually, once things are calmed down, we see that it's all working. Then we'll give you full control of Area B, and then eventually we'll see about Area C.
Yep.
It was meant to be zones of disengagement.
Yeah.
But they could use any pretext to stall it and say, oh, there's one person,
state of emergency.
Yeah, one Palestinian guy's dog bit an Israeli soldier or looked at the soldier funny. This means there's still insecurity. This means we can't disengage.
International Jim Crow laws, really, isn't it?
Yeah, and it allowed them to control the Palestinian life in the West Bank and in Gaza.
Right. So let's move forward now to.
So Second Intifada occurs, year 2000. There's a second uprising, because seeing there's the failure of Israel to stick to its word to disengage, and give back land in the West Bank to the Palestinians as it promised in stages. So this happens between the year 2000 and the year 2005. America commissions the Mitchell Report to see how they could stop the Intifada.
How many people died? Do you know how many people died in that one?
Well, in 3,000 dead Palestinians.
I mean, with the current conflict, there's already more dead Palestinians. So it shows you that we're really living in a historical moment, aren't we?
There hasn't been this many dead Palestinians in a short period of time since, arguably, 1967 or even before.
Yes.
In such a short amount of time, probably even before that, 1948, and the actual Nakba massacres that occurred. Okay, so but in response to the Second Intifada, at the dissatisfaction that Israel's not sticking to its word in disengaging because they never intended to disengage, and you've probably seen that leaked footage of Benjamin Netanyahu, where he would talk about how to kick out Palestinians in Area C. He'd say that the agreement said that the Israeli army is allowed to make military bases.
Yes.
In Area C. And they can declare it anywhere they want in Area C according to need. So Benjamin Netanyahu, in a leaked recording, said that it was actually he actually defined it as military areas, and they could be as big as he wanted.
Okay,
right? And then he can, and that was used to further kick out Palestinians out of the West Bank. So this is what's happening. And then eventually, in reaction to the Second Intifada, Israel used this as a pretext to start building walls, enclosing Area A parts of the West Bank, and by the way, they had already begun building settlements since 1967. And 1967 was when you might say more religious Zionists got involved. There was an argument before that saying that, you know, you can't make a state of Israel until the Messiah comes. But when the 1967 war happened, it was argued that this was divine favor on Israel. And then many religious Jews started to support Israel. And that's when they started to, you see the beginning of settler activity, religious settlers really willing to settle into the West Bank and make settlements there. Anyway, so...
then you've got two more, like, before the mowing of the lawn kind of every 2 to 3 years. Operations. You have, I'm thinking here, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, you have two more major events, which is the Lebanon War, the second Lebanon War with Hezbollah.
So, okay, so basically what we see is that let's go to 2006.
Sure.
So 2006 or 2005, the Israeli forces disengaged from Gaza. Because they had settlers there, it was hard to protect. There was
and disengagement doesn't mean that they no longer have effective military control. Because
they maintain their control.
A lot of these Israeli pundits and Zionists, people, propagandists, they would say, well, look, we're not occupying Gaza because we disengaged in 2005. But the truth of the matter is, disengagement is not a prerequisite for effective military control. In fact, most of the international law prerequisites for occupation is that if you're control of the airspace and you control of the sea and you control the population, which Israel maintains and had maintained since 2005 of the entire area. So they've got what was referred to in international law as effective military control, even since 2005. The fact that they've removed the settlements from there could even be said to be strategic, because every 3 to 4 years they're going to bomb from the sky. That would be the new strategy, wouldn't it be?
Yeah. So basically, there's been four involvements of Israel in Lebanon, not 3. There was also the South Lebanon War that occurred that I forgot to mention, but there was one that's more recent to us, which is the 2006 Lebanon War. So in 2006, Israel does two things. The Palestinians of Gaza elect Hamas via democratic elections. So Israel imposes a blockade over Gaza, limits their fishing, limits their getting supplies, and so on and so forth, and then invades Lebanon in 2006. Right, to destroy Hezbollah, as it says. And this is already after, of course, again, Hezbollah responding to Israeli attacks, raids, and so on and so forth into Lebanon. So there's this low-level conflict that didn't stop between the Israeli army and the Hezbollah. But they said, okay, we're going to destroy Hezbollah once and for all. So they go in, and it's a shambles. They end up losing a lot more fighters than they anticipated, and they withdraw in August 2006. So they've invaded Lebanon 4 times in this point in time. An army a country that can't strategically threaten them. It's not an existential threat at all whatsoever. And then the blockade of Hamas begins. And here's what you have to understand, that Hamas and the Palestinians of Gaza have been living under conditions where their infrastructure gets regularly bombed under this low-level ceasefire or peace agreement with the Israelis. So Israel has this policy called mowing the lawn.
Yes.
Right. And what they will do is they will... because Hamas is now the government of Gaza, they have to keep Gaza itself weak and unable,
demoralize them, subdue them.
Weak, subdued, unable to fight.
Yeah.
So they would regularly bomb infrastructure. They would regularly bomb Hamas political targets.
And there are so many. We know this is recent history now. There are so many different so-called operations that happened 3 to 4 years. And it brings me to a point, which is if you've got Protective Edge and Cast Lead and 2014 and 2021, and every 3 to 4 years you've become predictable. And you're going against what Sun Tzu said, which is don't push your enemy when he's desperate or something to that effect. Creating a desperate enemy, 3 to 4 years, they know you're going to bomb them anyway. So in many ways, what you're doing is you're creating an atmosphere for the kind of responses that they're getting, really, isn't it?
Well, you know what? Like one of the tactics Zionists do when they argue this is they say, well, this recent response by Hezbollah, or when they fired rockets or what have you, we didn't attack Hezbollah within the past couple months. Or at least,
exactly.
What is the past month? If you go back a few months, you say, oh, actually, we did when we bombed this. We took out one target, or we're drone strike there.
Yeah.
But they say we didn't do it recently,
so
within the last month, right?
But if someone
what they're trying to do is they try to separate Gaza from the West Bank, because as far as the Hamas and Fatah are concerned, these are one land and one people.
Of course.
So anything that Israel does to West Bank, Hamas considers to be done to them as well, and likewise the Palestinians on the ground as well, and so on. So. And of course, likewise, the West Bank Palestinians feel the same for the Palestinians in Gaza. So, in response to Israeli clearing operations, where they would clear the Temple Mount and the Masjid al-Aqsa, when they have visits by settlers or visits by right wingers, and especially those who've been implicated in killing Palestinians, what people don't realize is, see, it's a Muslim mosque, okay? Muslims go to pray in the mosque.
It's the custodians of it are the Jordanian Authority, right?
Yeah, it's meant to be a waqf under Jordanian Authority, but it's for Muslims to use. So when Israel organizes a visitation by people who are usually right wingers or others who do it deliberately, they have to first clear out the mosque. So they say, right, all you Muslims going to pray, usually men mostly, but basically they might keep kids there or very old people. But they actually go and send their security forces to clear everyone out. Israeli security forces enter the mosque to clear it all out.
Right. So I think you've done a really good job in summarizing the historical points. Obviously, the other things that we know, I mean, all these operations, many people have lived them, so they'll know about them. What we wanted to do in this episode was to give people a brief historical timeline, a skeleton that they can go like from all these things. We've had to kind of rush it a little bit because we've got flights to catch, as you know. But what I will say is the following, is that the thesis or the idea or the proposition that Israel's been defending itself all this time, knowing full well the facts that we've presented here, is an untenable one, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. Look, just to kind of summarize everything we've been saying, which is the Zionist project was to create a majority ethno-nationalist group in ethno-nationalistic state.
Yes.
That would represent their ethno-cultural, one distinct ethno-cultural group by a majority population.
Yeah.
So Zionists have always been concerned about demographics. They've always been wanting to make sure that the whole land of Palestine, all of it, is a ethno-nationalist state for Jews primarily.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, to achieve that, there were many tactics and strategies depending on the situation at hand, and they've always been interested in expanding beyond that. Some even said beyond into Jordan as well as the Sinai, and even into South Lebanon. Yeah. Now, historically speaking, what we've seen is a very consistent policy from Israel, which is it's been using force projection in the region. It regularly invades its neighbors. Even those people that oppose Israel but have entered into ceasefire agreements, the Israeli peace or ceasefire looks like low-level military operations. Yeah. So basically, if you say, look, I disagree with the Zionist project, but I'm going to have peace because I don't want my people to be killed, and we don't want to be attacked, are still going to be killed and attacked by target operations, by raids, by drone strikes, by airstrikes, and so on, which happened in Lebanon, which happens in Syria even in Syria right now, even up to Damascus airport got bombed, regularly. So this kind of happens on a low level. Yes. And add to the fact that if you're a Palestinian in the West Bank, the experience of living under Israeli occupation is like being in a vat of acid. Absolutely. Yeah, you could say, no one can say, well, you're in a vat of acid, but who's punching you? It's not the punching that is the issue. It's me being slowly dissolved. Absolutely. Yeah, by police harassment, by denying building permits for your family and so on and so forth, because over time you have children, they need to find a place to live. It's by just being shot by police for the slightest concerns that you might be a security risk, regardless of even whether you're a child or what have you. Even just recently, like the previous month, up to 20 to 30 Palestinian kids in the West Bank have been killed.
Yeah, that's according to UN reports, even.
Right? Forget about
actually, I think it's 44 in 2023
and bombings and so on and so forth. Yeah. So when this is your existence, where peace with Israel is continually killing your people if you're Palestinians, right? And not peace with Israel is you're just being bombed and massacred and being pushed out. And people say that Israel wants to push out and take half of Gaza now. Yeah. You can see that Israel has always been the aggressor. Absolutely. Because it always has had the same goal, always, which is a majority ethno-nationalist state on the whole land of Palestine. And currently speaking, in the whole land of Palestine, there's 50-50 Palestinian, Arab, and Israeli Jewish citizens. So this is not a demographic that the Zionists are going to accept. and they're going to aim, and they're always going to continue to pressure the Palestinians, force them to go eventually by continued harassment, continue bombing, continue so until they give up and they just leave, so they can get their majority ethno-nationalist state over the whole land of Palestine, as Ben Gurion, as they said from the very beginning.
Which is why they would never accept Gaza and the West Bank as part of Israel, because then they'd have democratic rights for those 2.2 million Palestinians in Gaza and however many millions, 3 million or more than that in the West Bank, which would maybe make them a majority, in fact, over 50%.
Yeah, they would never give the West Bank and the Gazan Palestinians equal citizenship, because that would be a 50% split.
They have to now be between a rock and a hard place. They can't be part of the state, but they have to be attacked, and the grass has to be cut.
They have to be pressured so that slowly over time Palestinians will leave.
Yes,
and they can get and they always hope there'll be more Jewish migration. So eventually that they can get a majority 80% ethno-nationalist state over the whole land of Palestine.
Well, if people have been watching this, and I thank you so much for joining me, people have been watching, this is a very brief historical timeline. Each and every single one of those things that we spoke about could have had many voluminous and encyclopedic books and chapters written on them. From the 1800s to all the way to 1920s to 1930s and 1967 war, 1973 war. We want to give people a basic education on this. And I think in the time that we've done a very good job. I thank you for joining me. I think with this, honestly, with this information, take it forward and make the argument. And because remember, this is an information war. With the arguments that have been provided here, go and do your own research. This is a basic building block and the, if you like, the historical skeleton. Use it and put your own meat on it. Because people in the West, English-speaking people, especially pro-Palestinian Muslim people and others, we have a moral obligation to keep the pressure and change the minds of the people. Do it on Twitter, do it on your websites, do it in all the websites, and using social media. This is my call to action.
Yeah, and I think we need to intellectually arm ourselves. And so, inshallah, I've done a Palestinian advocacy course, which you can find online. Yes. I'll be doing more Palestinian advocacy courses, inshallah, with I3 going forward.
Beautiful.
Also, check out my debates with Zionists.
Yes.
I have some debates coming up too.
And so that's Abdullah Al-Andalusi, for those who don't know his name. Put it on YouTube. You'll see all kinds of debates. He's one of the most premier and fantastic debaters in the Muslim world on this issue in particular. And he's done many courses on this, hence why he has so much knowledge on the matter. Thank you so much for joining. Make sure you subscribe, make sure you like, make sure you spread the message and arm yourself with the knowledge that you need. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.